Hello and welcome to another episode of the English Learning Podcast. I'm your host, Henry, and today we've got a really exciting topic lined up for you. Have you ever found yourself in a conversation where you know the words, but you just don't sound as natural as you'd like in English? It's a common challenge many learners face. Today we're going to dive into how to sound more natural when speaking English.
That's right, Henry. It's not just about knowing the vocabulary or grammar, it's also about how we say things, the flow of our speech, and sounding more like a native speaker. The good news is, there are some key strategies and tips you can use to make your English sound smooth and natural.
We'll be talking about everything from using contractions and intonation to understanding idiomatic expressions. Plus, we'll share some common mistakes that learners often make and how to fix them.
So if you're looking to improve your speaking and feel more confident in your English conversations, stick with us. We've got plenty of tips and examples to help you sound like a pro.
All right, let's get started. In today's episode, we'll break down the most effective ways to sound natural in English, and by the end, you'll be ready to take your speaking skills to the next level. Before we dive in, let's start with a fun question, Sarah. So we're talking about sounding natural in English today, but I have to ask, when you first started learning English, what's one thing that made you feel like you were really sounding natural in a conversation?
Oh, great question, Henry. I think for me, it was the first time I realized I could use contractions in real conversations. You know, things like saying I'm instead of I am, or you're instead of you are. That felt like I was finally speaking like a real English speaker and not reading from a textbook.
That's awesome. And for me, it was when I learned how to use little fillers in a conversation, like uh-huh or yeah, which really helped make me sound more relaxed and natural, especially in casual chats.
Absolutely. Those little things make such a big difference. It's funny how much more natural we sound when we use those everyday expressions.
Exactly. So as you can see, sounding natural in English isn't just about the words you use, but also about how you say them, and those small, everyday details are key. Now that we've had some fun with our icebreaker, let's get into why it's so important to sound natural when speaking English. We all know the basics: vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation, but what makes the real difference in a conversation is how natural you sound. Sarah, why do you think sounding natural is so important for English learners?
Well, Henry, I think the first thing that comes to mind is confidence. When we sound natural in a language, we feel more comfortable. And when we're comfortable, we speak more freely. It helps with fluency, too. It's not just about getting the words right. It's about communicating clearly and easily with others.
Right, exactly. If you sound too formal or rigid, people might have a harder time understanding you, or they might feel like you're not engaging with them. It can create a little distance in the conversation, but when you sound natural, it's like you're flowing with the conversation and people can connect with you more easily.
Exactly. And let's be honest, we all want to sound more like a native speaker, right? It makes a big difference in everyday situations like ordering food at a restaurant or chatting with friends. If you sound more like how native speakers actually speak, you'll find it's much easier to understand them too.
That's so true. And when you don't sound natural, people might think you're translating from your native language or trying too hard to be formal. This can sometimes cause confusion or even make you feel self-conscious, right?
Yes, exactly. And this is where learners sometimes get stuck. They focus so much on saying the perfect sentence that they forget to focus on how the sentence actually sounds. Being able to speak naturally helps you fit into real-world conversations without worrying about grammar mistakes all the time.
Well put, Sarah. So the bottom line here is that sounding natural makes communication smoother and helps you build better relationships with native speakers, whether it's for work, study, or just everyday conversations.
Yes, and it also boosts your confidence, which is the key to improving in any language. The more natural you sound, the more you'll feel like you belong in the conversation. and that confidence will help you keep improving your skills.
All right, now that we understand why sounding natural is so important, let's dive into how we can actually do it. There are several strategies you can use to sound more natural in English, and we're going to walk you through some of the best ones.
That's right. Let's start with something really simple but super effective. Using contractions. If you've ever spoken to a native speaker, you'll notice that they often shorten words like I am to I'm or you are to you're. These contractions make speech sound much smoother and more casual.
Exactly, Sarah. I know a lot of English learners feel like they have to say the full form all the time. I am going. You are doing. But in everyday conversations, natives almost always use the contractions. It makes things sound much more relaxed.
Right. And it's not just about sounding casual, but also about sounding fluent. Imagine you're in a fast-paced conversation and you keep saying, I am going to, instead of I'm going to. It can slow you down. But when you use contractions, it helps you keep up with the flow of the conversation.
So if you're not already using contractions, try it out. Start saying I'm, you're, we're, there in place of I am, you are, etc. You'll notice a huge difference in how natural you sound.
Next up is intonation and stress. This is one of the most important aspects of sounding natural. Intonation is the rise and fall of your voice when you speak, and stress is about emphasizing certain words or syllables.
Exactly. Let's take a simple sentence. I love learning English. Now, if you say it flat, I love learning English, it sounds kind of robotic, right? But if you add some natural intonation, like I love learning English, with emphasis on love, it sounds way more natural.
Right. And it's not just about stressing random words, there's a pattern to it. In English, we usually stress content words, things like nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. So in our example, we stress love because it's the most important word in that sentence.
And don't forget about a rising and falling intonation. If you're asking a question like, are you coming? Your voice should rise at the end. But if you're making a statement like, I'm coming, your voice usually falls.
It's all about rhythm. You want to avoid sounding like you're just reading words off a page. The rhythm of your speech helps you sound more engaging and natural.
Absolutely. Now let's move on to something that can make your English sound much more like a native speaker. Phrasal verbs and idiomatic expressions.
Yes, native speakers use a lot of phrasal verbs, like pick up, turn on, look after, and idiomatic expressions, things like break the ice, hit the nail on the head, or in the long run.
These are words and phrases that you won't always find in textbooks, but they're everywhere in casual conversations. The more you use them, the more natural you'll sound. For example, instead of saying, I don't understand, you could say, I'm lost. Or instead of saying, I am very tired, you could say, I'm exhausted.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to learn and use these expressions. They'll not only help you sound more like a native speaker, but also help you understand other people better, since they use them all the time.
Right. And speaking of casual conversations, let's talk about informal vocabulary and slang. There are a lot of everyday words and expressions that native speakers use, like gonna for going to, or wanna for want to.
Slang is another way to sound natural. Think about how many times you've heard someone say, "What's up?" instead of "How are you?" or "I'm good" instead of "I'm doing well." These little tweaks can make your speech sound much more relaxed and natural.
And don't worry too much about using the perfect vocabulary. In casual settings, it's all about using words that make you feel comfortable and let you fit in with the flow of the conversation.
Yes. Another thing to keep in mind is short responses and fillers. Native speakers often use short responses like, uh-huh, yeah, right, or even just, Mm, to show they're listening and to keep the conversation going.
And it's not just about filling space, it's also about showing engagement. If someone says, I just got back from vacation, you can say, really? That's awesome, instead of just waiting in silence for them to finish.
Exactly. These little responses make conversations feel much more dynamic and natural. And remember, don't be afraid to use them. It's part of the flow of normal conversation.
So to recap, here are some key strategies to sound natural. Use contractions, focus on intonation and stress, get familiar with phrasal verbs and idioms, use informal vocabulary and slang, and don't forget to use short responses and fillers to keep the conversation alive. All right, we've talked about strategies to sound more natural, but now let's get into some practical tips for improving your speaking skills, as well as some common mistakes to avoid. Sarah, what's one tip you would give to English learners who want to sound more natural?
My number one tip is to practice with native speakers as much as possible. Even if you're just chatting for a few minutes each day, getting used to how native speakers talk will help you pick up on those little nuances like intonation, slang, and the natural flow of conversation.
Absolutely, and don't be afraid to make mistakes. It's all about practice. And the more you practice with real people, the more comfortable you'll get with sounding natural. Even if you don't understand everything, just being part of the conversation helps you improve.
Exactly. Another great tip is to listen to English content, whether it's podcasts, TV shows, movies, or even YouTube videos. Pay close attention to how native speakers talk, especially in casual settings. Notice how they use contractions, informal vocabulary, and fillers.
That's a great one. Listening to native speakers helps you understand the rhythm and patterns of natural speech, but it's also important to repeat what you hear. Try mimicking the way they speak. This is called shadowing. It's one of the best ways to get your speech to sound more natural.
Exactly. So, if you're watching a TV show, try to repeat the dialogue out loud. It's a fun way to get your mouth used to the rhythm and sounds of the language. And if you're not sure about how something sounds, look it up or ask a native speaker.
And here's another tip. Focus on meaning, not perfection. Sometimes learners get so caught up in saying things perfectly that they forget to focus on communicating the message. Native speakers don't always speak perfectly. They make mistakes, they use slang, and sometimes they even break grammar rules. The key is to focus on getting your message across clearly, even if it's not perfect.
Yes, definitely. And speaking of mistakes, one common mistake I see a lot is that learners try to speak too formally. They stick to textbook phrases like, "How are you?" and "I am fine, thank you." But in casual conversations, this can sound a little stiff or robotic.
Right, and it's also common for learners to be afraid of making mistakes with her slang or informal language. They might avoid using things like gonna or wanna because they think it's incorrect. But in casual conversations, native speakers use these all the time.
Another mistake I see is that learners focus too much on grammar and perfect sentences. While grammar is important, if you're constantly thinking about it while speaking, it can interrupt the flow of your conversation. Instead, focus on speaking naturally and confidently. The more you speak, the more you'll improve over time.
Exactly, Sarah. Don't let the fear of making mistakes stop you. Instead, try to embrace the mistakes as part of the learning process. They're a sign that you're pushing yourself outside your comfort zone, and that's where the growth happens.
And here's another thing. Don't be afraid to use pauses. Pausing while you speak gives you a moment to think, and it also sounds more natural. Native speakers often pause when they're thinking about what to say next, so don't feel like you have to speak quickly all the time.
Great point. Pausing is important for both you and your listener. It makes you sound more thoughtful and confident. Plus, it helps your brain catch up, especially if you're speaking quickly or using new vocabulary.
Exactly. So, to sum it up, here are some practical tips to sound more natural. Practice with native speakers, listen to English content, shadow native speakers, focus on meaning, and don't worry about being perfect. And most importantly, don't be afraid to make mistakes. It's all part of the learning journey.
And remember to avoid common mistakes like speaking too formally, overthinking grammar, or avoiding slang. Embrace informal language and use pauses to keep the conversation flowing naturally. All right, Sarah, it's time for a little practice. Let's do a role play to demonstrate how sounding natural in English can make a big difference in a conversation. We'll use some of the strategies we've discussed today, like using contractions, informal language, and fillers, to make the conversation sound more casual and relaxed.
Sounds great. Let's say I'm meeting you for the first time at a coffee shop. You're going to greet me, and we'll have a casual conversation. We'll try to make it sound as natural as possible.
Perfect. Okay, here we go. Hey, Sarah, how's it going?
Hey, Henry, I'm good. Thanks for asking. How about you?
I'm doing great. Just finished a long week, so I'm really looking forward to the weekend. Got any fun plans?
Actually, yeah, I'm gonna meet up with some friends tomorrow. We're going to this new restaurant I've been wanting to try. What about you?
Sounds awesome. I'm just going to take it easy. Maybe watch a movie and relax. It's been a busy few days.
I hear you. It's nice to just have a chill day sometimes. Oh, by the way, have you seen that new show everyone's talking about?
Yeah, I have. It's really good. I've been binge watching it all week. The plot twists are insane.
Oh, I'm definitely gonna check it out. It's been on my list, but first I have to finish this other show. You know how it is. So many options.
I know, right? It's like there's always something new to watch. But hey, sometimes it's good to just stick with the classics. So there you have it. Using contractions, casual expressions like gonna, wanna, and fillers like you know how it is makes the conversation sound much more relaxed and natural. Did you notice how much smoother the conversation was when we didn't worry about being too formal?
Exactly. And we didn't try to overthink grammar. We just focused on getting the message across and having a fun, casual chat. This is how native speakers interact with each other in everyday life.
That's the goal, to make you feel like you can join in on conversations like this without overthinking every word. Practice makes perfect, so don't be afraid to start using these strategies in your own conversations. Now, before we wrap up today's episode, let's take a few minutes to answer some of the questions our listeners have sent in. We always love hearing from you guys, so keep the questions coming.
Yes, definitely. Let's dive into the first one. Here's a question from Emily, who asks, I get nervous when speaking with native speakers. How can I stop worrying about making mistakes and just sound more natural?
That's a great question, Emily. Sarah, what do you think? How can someone get over that nervousness?
I totally understand how you feel, Emily. First of all, it's important to remember that everyone makes mistakes, even native speakers. The key is to focus on communication, not perfection. So instead of worrying about every little mistake, just keep the conversation going. You can also practice speaking with people who are supportive and patient, like language exchange partners, to build your confidence.
Exactly, and remember, being natural doesn't mean you have to speak perfectly. Just try to enjoy the conversation and trust that people are more interested in hearing you rather than focusing on any small errors. And as you practice more, you'll feel more comfortable.
Great advice, Henry. Let's move on to the next question from Raj. He asks, how do I improve my intonation and stress in English? I always sound monotone.
Good one. Intonation and stress are crucial for sounding natural. Raj, try this. When you listen to native speakers, pay attention to how their voices rise and fall. Start mimicking that rhythm. You can even practice with simple sentences. For example, say, I love English with emphasis on love. I love English. Then try saying, I love English with the emphasis on English. I love English.
Exactly. Also, if you can, record yourself speaking. Listen back to check if your intonation sounds too flat, and then try to adjust it. You can also practice with YouTube videos or podcasts. Pause and repeat after the speaker, copying their tone and stress.
Good tips, Sarah. And don't forget, the more you practice, the more comfortable your intonation will sound. It's all about repetition and getting used to the natural rhythm of the language.
All right, let's take our last question from Lucas, who says, what's the best way to practice using slang and informal phrases without sounding forced?
Ah, that's a great one, Lucas. You definitely don't want to sound like you're trying too hard. The best way to practice slang is to hear it naturally in conversation, either through TV shows, movies, or podcasts. Pay attention to how and when native speakers use slang. It's often in casual situations or when they're speaking to friends.
Yes, and don't force slang into every sentence. Use it when it feels right. If you're talking about something casual, try using a phrase like, "That's awesome," or "No worries." But don't overdo it. The goal is to sound natural, not to cram in as many slang words as you can.
Exactly, just let it flow. As you become more comfortable with English, slang and informal phrases will start feeling more natural and less forced.
And that's all the time we have for questions today. Thank you so much for sending them in, and we hope our answers helped.
Remember, sounding natural in English is a process, and with practice, you'll get better and more confident every day. Keep using the tips we shared, and don't be afraid to make mistakes. That's all part of the journey. Well, that's all we have for today's episode of the English Learning Podcast. We've covered a lot of ground, from the importance of sounding natural in English to practical tips, common mistakes, and even a little role play. We hope you're feeling inspired to start speaking more naturally and confidently.
Absolutely. Remember, it's all about practice, and the more you use contractions, slang, and focus on the rhythm of English, the more natural you'll sound. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. They're a natural part of the learning process.
That's right, Sarah. And if you have any questions or want to share your experiences with sounding natural in English, be sure to drop us a comment or connect with us on social media. We'd love to hear from you.
And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. We have plenty more tips and conversations coming your way to help you on your English learning journey.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode. Until then, keep practicing, stay confident, and keep speaking naturally. Take care.